I have the distinct pleasure of starting the briefing by Colonel Dr. Eran Lerman. He's Vice President of JISS, Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Most of you know Eran very well. Still, if there is somebody there that has not heard yet about Eran Lerman, I'll introduce him. Dr. Lerman was Deputy Director for Foreign Policy and International Affairs at the National Security Council in the Israeli Prime Minister Office.
It's a pretty long title for a short guy.
In the IDF military intelligence for over 20 years. He also served for 8 years as director of the Israel in the Middle East Office of the American Jewish Committee in Jerusalem. He also teaches in the Middle East Studies program at Shalem College in Jerusalem and postgraduate programs Tel Aviv University and the National Defense College. We all know he's an expert on Israel's foreign relations and on the Middle East. He's proud to be a third generation Sabra and holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and a mid-career MPA from Harvard University. And he'll speak about Biden, Bennet, and the challenges ahead. Eran, it's your floor.
Thank you. I should add, by the way, that my first book ever finally came out a few weeks ago on Anglo-Egyptian relations in the 1940s, nothing to do with our current dilemmas. Look, clearly nothing is more important for the future of Israel in the passage that lies ahead than coming to a workable understanding with this American administration, which is in itself a challenge because the Democratic Party, which now governs both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, is in itself divided on the question of Israel, and clearly has an aggressively anti-Israeli element at its left-wing margins. And this, of course, adds to the complexity of the challenge. And adds to this, to be frank, the baggage of left behind by the previous Israeli government under Netanyahu, which could barely hide its overt identification with one side in American politics, which does not happen to be the side in power right now. And that baggage has definitely burdened the relationship as Biden was elected and as Congress, the Senate and the House both reverted to full democratic control or remained in full democratic control. Now, the implications of all of this are momentous because one huge decision lies ahead, and others less urgent but still quite important require American attention or require American decisions as well. And I'm putting aside the Palestinian issue, which quite interestingly, the Biden administration also understands right now that it would be futile to push for a decisive action when this would tear apart the Israeli government and may bring about a crisis that would reinstate an Israeli leadership that they're not fond of, and at the same time also burden the Palestinian leadership, namely Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, with something that they can simply not deliver on. And frankly, it reminds me of an episode when Yossi Cohen was still National Security Advisor and I was his deputy, and a group of Europeans came up and said, after the briefing, they said, we are going from here to see the Palestinian leader. And Yossi says, don't exaggerate. Abbas is not a leader. Bennet may be a leader, or this government is not leaderless, but it is incapable of taking decisions. The Palestinians are incapable of taking decisions for other reasons, and therefore this is a futile effort. So let's set that aside, and questions may arise. But right now, even Biden's speech basically, let's say, reflects this realization. But what is really at stake, first and foremost, is the question of the Iranian nuclear project. And as we speak, the signs are that the present government in Iran is not really interested in returning to the limitations of the JCPOA. They have rushed forward on a whole range of activities that would need to be rolled back very radically, both in terms of the size of the stockpile, in terms of the level of enrichment, which has gone up to 60, and from there it's a very short skip and hop to weapon grade level of enrichment. I assume you're all roughly familiar with nuclear enrichment. You get uranium, natural uranium 0.7% is 235, which is isotope, which is fissile material for a bomb. You start enriching, you can enrich to 3 or 4% for civilian purposes to feed power stations. But when the Iranians started pushing first for 20 on the putative argument that they may need it one day for nuclear submarines, well, Australia may need it now, but Iran doesn't. And then they went for 60, and 60 clearly has no other purpose than being one last way station before 94, which is weapon grade level of enrichment, bombs and bombs only. Moreover, they are tooling metal uranium, which is again a necessary step for one purpose only, namely to shape the bombs and fit them into possibly into missile warheads. Now, they are not yet there. There's an argument in Israel as to how far they may be in specific capacities, such as tooling and making of a payload for specific missiles. The former head of the Mossad just recently said that they may be not quite that near. He was trying to make the case for his own achievements, but he is also trying to make the case that the Americans need not bend over backwards to stop the Iranians through diplomatic means, because they're not yet there, and we may have the time and the means to stop them. But should we gamble on this? I'm not entirely sure, and the Americans are not entirely sure. And here comes the huge question. What do we do in the next few weeks and months if the Iranians are not even willing to fold back to the highly problematic propositions of the agreement of the JCPOA, let alone go beyond it to what President Biden in his campaign called a longer and stronger agreement, the kind of thing that Secretary Pompeo discussed with the French before Donald Trump decided he's not interested in such nuances and nixed the entire operation. But longer, stronger, more greater limitations. The Iranians are showing no interest whatsoever in abandoning what they have, and they are pretty near to the status of a threshold state. Now, there are threshold states and threshold states. One intelligent British intelligence officer, when I was still in my other life, asked me, Japan also is essentially a threshold state, 3 months, and they turn the screw and they have it. They have a huge pile of plutonium from their breeders, etc., etc. I said, well, you know, in 1939, you were producing Spitfires and the Germans were producing Messerschmitts. But there's no moral equivalence between the two ventures. And there's no moral equivalence between Japan's putative threshold status, when we all know that they have no intention and no need for that. Whereas we all know what Iran is seeking its capacity for. They want to dominate the region, and they want to be in the business of destroying Israel. I don't necessarily posit a sudden nuclear attack on Israel, but nuclear extortion of Israel, or an attempt by the Iranians, which is beginning to take shape, to demand that Israel would also disarm if they would make any gestures. All of these are extremely dangerous propositions that Israel cannot possibly accept. So can there be an agreed alternative? I have seen indications, including from the contacts of my good friend and our donor, Ahmed Shara'i, a Moroccan Muslim and a dear friend of Israel who's worried about this, that the Biden administration may be trying to, or Rob Malley anyway, may be trying to reach out to the Gulfies and cook up an Iranian-Saudi understanding in continuation of things that they've begun to discuss about the future of Iraq and Yemen maybe. And in the process, this would actually isolate Israel and limit Israel's freedom of action. And that would indicate that the administration is worried about Israel's intention to act, which was made manifest, among others, by Foreign Minister Lapid when he was, after his conversations with Blinken, that Israel retains the right to act in self-defense and, if necessary, prevent the Iranian project from coming to fruition. So huge questions are at stake. I hope that our newly found friends in the Gulf will not put their trust in a rickety understanding with the Iranians, which would collapse the moment the Iranians realize that it is not backed by a credible military threat. The only thing that could possibly drive the Iranians to the table with a prospect of getting real limitations on their project, not the flimsy ones of Vienna in 2015, is a combination of serious sanctions and a credible military threat. Because otherwise they will say, well, let's endure the sanctions, emerge as a nuclear power, and everyone will bow to us anyway. So we must make it clear that we will not allow this to happen one way or the other, and we have the capacity to prevent this from happening. And this is what is at stake between us and the Americans now. I have to say, personally, without regard to any other internal Israeli issue, there is a point of benefit in this, in that the argument is taking place free of the suspicion that this is an Israeli government with an internal game to play in American politics, which it is not. I mean, this government has made it very explicit. They seek bipartisan support, and it is therefore a fact-based rather than a politically based discussion that we must have now with the Americans. But it's a challenge because the Biden administration has embarked on a huge project internally. They are very much absorbed in this challenge of spending huge amounts of money on infrastructure and jump-starting the economy and leveling the social playing field. That this is as big as it has been since Johnson, or maybe even great society, or maybe since Roosevelt. This is way above and beyond anything that Obama ever dared to try. And therefore, how willing they would be to actually engage in the necessary power play with Iran in the next few months is an open question. But it is very important that if and when we find ourselves in Israel in the position of having to take our own actions, with the backing and to some extent the implicit or explicit blessing of our newly found friends in the Arab world. The Saudi foreign minister just the other day was saying very clearly that the Iranian project is a threat to the entire region. And so are Iranian provocations. So if we need to act, we need to do this with the deep understanding and support of at least our friends in Washington on both sides of the political aisle. And they do exist. It is not as if by now it is a story about pro-Israeli Republicans and anti-Israeli Democrats. There are anti-Israeli Democrats, but there are also other voices. And here the indication, I mean, the issue is Iran. But the test ground recently in September was the vote on Iron Dome. As you may recall, Israel asked for an additional $1 billion to replenish our stock of missiles for the Iron Dome batteries, the interceptors. Tmirim by the Hebrew initials, Tilim Yarti. And although we committed in the MOU signed with the Obama administration for the next 10, in 2016, for the next 10 years, that's going to until fiscal year 2025, we committed not to ask for more than $3.8 billion on average annually, or $38 billion in aggregate over these 10 years, which is in itself a substantial sum. Nevertheless, there was a provision for emergencies, and the Guardian of the Wall operation did constitute an emergency, and so we made this request. And I have to say that the Biden administration in this respect acted with alacrity and put this billion into the continuing resolution. And then, because the Republicans were opposed to the continuing resolution that keeps the administration funded in the absence of a budget, because they were opposed to it on other grounds, and one and all, there was no Republican vote for it, the small group of anti-Israeli progressives, there are many progressives in the Democratic Party, but the anti-Israeli element is much smaller, led by our friend, quote unquote, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her fellow girls from the squad, Rashida Tlaib, Ilham Omar, etc. And they told the Democratic leadership that they would fail the continuing resolution unless these $1 billion were dropped. And clearly, they were trying to demonstrate their strength against Israel. The interesting result, which in itself I would find cautiously encouraging, that's all I can say. I'm careful not to be enthusiastic about it, but I did suggest in a JSS paper that this was a story of Balaam coming to curse and ending up giving us a blessing. They forced the issue, and since they chose the most stupid grounds possible, because this is a purely defensive system that actually saves Palestinian lives, because if Israeli lives were lost in large numbers, we would have to react in a very different manner than we do against incoming rockets. So they chose this ground, and the Democratic leadership in the House, that's to say Nancy Pelosi less actively, and Steny Hoyer, Majority Leader, and the Chairman of Appropriations, Rosa DeLauro, moved within a day, basically, to table a resolution that would give us this freestanding $1 billion. And by the way, that's a greater gift than having it in the CR, because the CR can get stuck in the Senate. Although in the Senate also we ran against a Republican isolationist, Rand Paul, but overall it will fly in the Senate at the end, whereas I'm not quite sure about the continuing resolution. And the significant thing is that it passed the House 420 to 9, which is to say that as many Democrats voted, precisely as 210 from each party, as many Democrats voted for this additional aid to Israel as the number of Republicans. So something of the historical bipartisan base is still there, but the challenge is to maintain it, build it up, shore it up by a clear understanding among American Jews and within the American public of what is at stake, what is the nature of the Iranian regime that we face, what is the nature of the challenge that is posed to us, and why what I call a CMT, credible military threat, and maybe even going from threats to action, may be absolutely necessary given the nature of what we are up against. But these are not the only issues. We need to see whether the administration will take steps beyond the meeting that was in itself quite welcome. The meeting between Secretary of State Blinken and the foreign ministers of Israel and of the Emirates was an act of approval and support for the Abraham Accords, which, of course, the Biden administration inherited from Trump, and being the anti-Trump, there was for a while a question mark hanging as to whether they will support and enthusiastically push forward with these agreements. For the time being, the signs are modestly positive. I have to say, I have although we all know that Jewish American secretaries of state sometimes feel obliged to prove that they are serving their country rather than their people. But Tony Blinken, after all, was raised since the age of 8 by a Holocaust survivor, who went to Australia for his studies. I don't know if you're familiar with the story. He's the stepson of Shmuel Pizar, who survived Auschwitz and then was invited to, somehow dragged to Australia, was already a hoodlum, a petty criminal in post-occupation Germany, and then somehow the family got hold of him, dragged him to Paris, sent him to Melbourne, where he ultimately became a brilliant lawyer and went on to great things. And he married Tony Blinken's mother when Tony was 8, I think. So, and I've heard Tony speak about him with great passion and emotion. So I think these people understand. Biden has been a friend of Israel, a certified friend of Israel, not of every Israeli policy, but of Israel for many years. So it's not without some hope that we look to reconstruct the bipartisan elements of the relationship. But it is being challenged. Iran is the uppermost question, but there's also the question of attitudes towards our friends in the region. Egypt is being targeted by elements within the administration and the Democratic Party for its human rights record, which is, quite frankly, not stellar. What Sisi did in August 2013 to consolidate his rule was the worst massacre in Egyptian history, going back hundreds of years, in Rabi al-Adawiya, and people are under severe repressive measures, but at the same time, he's facing the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an existential threat, and not only to him and to Egypt. And so we seriously need to shore up support for Egypt in Washington, and that's definitely an ongoing challenge. Same with Jordan. While we are all immensely excited about the potential of the Gulf relationships, we must never let our eyes off our closer peace partners, namely Egypt and Jordan. And this is an issue that will continue to come up. We need to keep an eye on other aspects of American policy, the reduction, of course, in the shadow of Afghanistan, the notion of American retreat has its benefits for Israel because we become more important for the region and even for Washington. But at the same time, it is also encouraging or putting wind in the sails of our common enemies. One last point, as I said, let's leave the Palestinian issue aside. I would mention is an interesting development in the last few weeks is the integration of Israel actively, not just by decision, but in practice, in the Central Command of the United States military. The commander of the Fifth Fleet and the commander of CENTCOM have been to Israel for visits. Israel now participates not as an exercise, but in operations in the Red Sea alongside the Fifth Fleet. This creates commonality with others in the region that are under CENTCOM's wings, such as Egypt on one side and Saudi Arabia on the other, at the level of military relevance. So that's a positive. And I should mention that this week we are also seeing, as we do every 2 years, a huge international Air Force exercise on Israeli soil with the Americans, but also with the participation of the British Air Force, the German, imagine the Luftwaffe flying in the skies of Israel, a commander of the German Air Force going with Amikam Nok into Yad Vashem to pay his respects, but also participating in a major military exercise with Israel. India is represented, the Greeks, it's the largest ever on Israeli skies, and it tells you something about Israel's place in international relations in terms of what could be called military diplomacy. And here, there is an element within the American administration on which we can count nowadays in a very different way than was the case, say, in the days of old, when the Pentagon saw itself essentially as an opponent of the Israeli relationship, a special relationship. Today, from the lower rungs of American military command all the way to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the commanders of the regional commands, EUCOM and CENTCOM, etc., have come to appreciate Israel's contribution, and they constitute this is one of the elements in American administrations that doesn't change over when the president comes in. The diplomats all go home with a pink slip and can be appointed or not. The entire structure of government down to from secretary, deputy, undersecretary, assistant secretary, at all departments, they all go home and The trucks drive extra hours in and out of Washington, D.C., as people move out and people move in. But the military is essentially a continuum, an important element of continuum, a continuity, and that is an important cornerstone for Israeli policy now that they've come to recognize what we bring to the table in terms of technology, in terms of military capabilities, in terms of innovative approaches, in terms of doctrine, in terms of cyber, etc. So all of this is having its own influence on the relationship in ways which were not relevant in the past. So I think I'll rest here and open this for questions.
Yeah, can I please
please unmute yourself.
Yeah, I've got a question. Yaakov Katz in the Jerusalem Post this week wrote an article about the Americans opening the consulate again in Jerusalem.
I should have mentioned.
And it seems to me the way he wrote it, it's seems to be quite an issue. Could even break the government if the Israelis don't agree to it. And Bennet said he won't agree to it, and the Foreign Minister Lapid said he won't agree to it. How serious do you see that as an issue, and where do you see it going?
Well, frankly, my flesh will not crawl about the government falling apart at least as long as Netanyahu is adamant that he would hold on to the leadership of Likud. This government will not fall apart. It will fall apart very quickly once there's a change in Likud, but not any moment before that. I don't think the left would leave if we don't allow it, and I doubt that we would allow it in the shape and form that the Americans intend. But there could be, and by the way, we wrote a very forceful, I wrote a forceful argument for JISS a few months ago against this proposed reinstitution of a representation to the Palestinians on Israeli sovereign soil. Now, if the Americans really, really want to have a diplomatic channel with the Palestinians, let them have a commercial office or whatever they call it in Taipei, in Ramallah. I think we may find this problematic, but not nearly as problematic as having a diplomatic representation to the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, or even in West Jerusalem, challenging, undermining basically the full import of the move of the embassy in 2017. So I think there can be some kind of a solution can be found if the Americans fully understand that this is an issue that Israel would very strongly take offense about, and of course this is our sovereign soil. The Americans cannot act without our consent. So it is a challenge. It is indicative of a problem in terms of the administration's ongoing commitment to the two-state solution, which is not the position of the present government of Israel. The position of the government of Israel is that it has no position because it cannot afford to have a position without breaking up. But I would hope, I don't know for sure, because this will require a delicate negotiation. I think that there are things that the Americans can do for the Palestinians to compensate if we are determined to prevent the consulate from reopening, and we should be determined to prevent from reopening. The implications would be very troubling. Anyone who encourages the Palestinians to believe that Jerusalem would one day be divided between us and them is doing the Palestinians a disservice, because that's like selling them on hallucinogenic drugs. It's a fantasy. It's impractical. It cannot be done, and the sooner they come to that realization, the greater the prospect that one day we could come to terms.
Thank you for that answer, Eran, of the question that Gary pipped me at asking. It was a very good question. because notwithstanding the very positive approach you've given about the Americans and things are still okay and so on, there are a few things that they're doing which are giving certain signals, and the one that Gary raised is one of those signals. The other one is joining the United Nations Human Rights Council again coming in, which also means full of funding, which Trump had cut back. So we worry a little bit about that. And the other question that I'm also concerned about is that Frame wrote a very significant article just in the last week or so about the current Israeli government's acquiescence to America wanting to support again the Iran deal, and how we achieve a better understanding with the government that of the significance of what they've done.
Well, Ephraim and I are in full agreement that the JCPOA was a bad piece of work. I'm now reading Bill Burns' memoirs, and you can see that the culprit here, if I may offer an observation, is first and foremost John Kerry, who was very eager to have this diplomatic breakthrough to his name, and conducted himself with about as much wisdom as he did on the Palestinian issue. He ended up with, the Palestinians were calling him behind his back al-Tawil al-Habil, the silly long one. And on the Iranian question, you see that very serious people were pushed to offer the Iranians unnecessary concessions, because basically the administration has gambled on the success of this operation and had not and could not dial back. Now, it's a decent tactical question whether the Israeli government should publicly and noisily, or publicly but less noisily, or not publicly at all, make it clear that the JCPOA as such is a bad deal. Frankly, the fact that during the Obama years, this became a sort of political football, makes it a bit more difficult for an Israeli government, the present Israeli government, to be very loud in its concerns, because then immediately this would be tagged as another attempt to interfere in the American political process, which is what they are trying to avoid. At the same time, I think they're making it very clear that we will not accept Iran even at a threshold state, whereas the administration is saying they will not allow Iran to have the bomb. There's a subtle difference there. It's not so subtle, because it concerns the timetables for action and intelligence basis for action. So the government has taken the position that it is not openly opposing the JCPOA, a return to the JCPOA, but they're openly opposing Iran, the idea that Iran could be allowed to remain a threshold state. A full return to the JCPOA would put that off for a short while, and meanwhile we can plan other actions. So I think this is a position that emerged from serious internal discussions. Our National Security Advisor, Eyal Hulata, I think knows as much as anyone in the world knows about the Iranian nuclear program. I would say this very delicately, from within. He is a nuclear physicist who has been in charge of this portfolio in the Mossad before he came over to the Prime Minister's office. I think we're having a very detailed conversation with the Americans. Whether we say this out loud or we say this sotto voce in a lower voice The one thing that is ultimately important is for Israel to retain its freedom of action. And that should be made very clear. Whether we've promised the Americans not to surprise them, does that mean that we will not act? It doesn't. It could mean that we will act even without their explicit approval. We've done this before. So, and of course, we have an ongoing war with the Iranians on many fronts. People have been asking me, what do I know about the demise of this guy, Midhat Abbas, in the Golan the other day, who got a bullet to his head. Well,
Yes.
He met his chest. Okay, he met his death, as they say. Well, that reminded me of the situation when I was asked once if I know who killed Ahmad Mournea in 2008. So instead of answering, I tried to imagine a situation where our friend Inspector Clouseau from the funny French films is talking to the widow, and he says, Madame Mournea, did the deceased have any enemies? And she goes and brings the Beirut phone book and the list of members of the United Nations. So there were, regardless of whether we had reasons, this man had many, he was a Syrian regime agent and an Iranian agent, and there were many people who do not mourn him today. But there is whether or not we did this one particular thing, we are at war with Iran on many fronts. It's now extended to the Azeri front, and there's a paper of mine on should we carefully handle the Iranian provocations against Azerbaijan. The Gulf, the ships, the attempted murder of an Israeli businessman in Cyprus, which is apparently related to Iran, although this is not fully confirmed yet by the Cypriot authorities. We are at a kind of low-intensity war, low-intensity conflict. And we need the Americans to understand, and our friends in the region to also understand and appreciate that we will persist in this effort, whether the Biden administration likes it or not.
I have a question. What is the thinking or tactic behind this issue of, I understand they're raising under the table, the issue of the settlements. I would have thought the idea that the settlements are an obstacle to peace would be dead in the water after the Abraham Accords. Why is it now being raised? And if so, what about all the areas in Area C, which the Europeans are settling?
Well, I think the government in Israel...
Sorry, not settlements, Judean Samaria, kingdoms of Judean Samaria.
Well, I once bumped into a young American who told me, American Jew, very proudly told me, you know, I'm not Jewish American, I'm Judean American. That's more precise. Jew is a short. But frankly, the problem is not necessarily with the American position, which is of course much less friendly than that of the, I would say, the Trump and the Pompeo administration. Pompeo, you know, made his position manifest by visiting the magnificent winery at Psagot, which I recommend to all of you. Peak is really peak wine, and that was the position of the Trump administration. That there's nothing illegal or illegitimate about the settlement project. This is not the case with the Biden administration. I think their language or their logic is, let's keep the prospect of a two-state solution alive looking down the road. We're not going to push for it now, but let's not kill, pray do not kill it by making its realization impossible on the ground. So that's their message, essentially. But the problem is not necessarily with them. The problem is within the Israeli government, which extends from Mahmoud Abbas and Meretz to far to the right of Netanyahu. It is a unique experiment in Israeli politics. It is focused on putting the economy on fast forward. By the way, I don't know if it's their doing or just the momentum already building, but what's going on is unbelievable. We feel it. Your dollars are worth less and less, and we feel it because the flow of investment into Israel is huge, and the size of our dollar reserves begins to remind me of Taiwan in the 90s. It's really old Pinchas Sapir is rolling in his grave. You know, he never managed to get 1 year without a trade deficit. And what's happening now is amazing. We are producing unicorns like one a week, if you know the term, billion-dollar startups. So all of this is very positive, but this is a government that can make no steps forward or backward on the Palestinian issue without falling apart. So the settlement policy is basically going to be, we keep what we have. We avoid any major changes on the ground in Judea and Samaria. Jerusalem, we shall have to wait and see whether this government feels capable of moving on, say, Givat Hamatos or E1. I doubt it, but this is at least not explicitly out of the question. Where they are moving is on the Golan, which is consensual. I don't think Abbas and the far left have raised objections. And in the Negev, increasing the Jewish presence in areas which are not sufficiently populated. But in Judea Samaria, it's essentially an internal Israeli question as much as it has to do with the positions of the Biden administration. Mind you, we need to be frank about this. Even under Trump, who was a friend and his position legitimized the project, there was not much enthusiasm in Washington for new Israeli settlements, and none were built. There were, except for one that was offered as an alternative to another that had to be demolished because it was apparently, according to the courts, built on private Palestinian land. But this was the one singular exception. Every time when I was still with the Netanyahu government, and the Europeans kept coming to me and talking about, then you keep building new settlements, and I said, name one. There were none. Under Netanyahu. He was very careful under Obama and even under Trump not to take this further. We have the main challenges we face are in Jerusalem and in the blocks, and pushing forward with beyond what people are doing on their own, the Hill boys, etc. The government has been very cautious even under Netanyahu.
Well, just following on from that, if there were no new settlements and there weren't under Netanyahu and Trump, why is the issue being raised? Is it an issue with the growth in the existing settlements as well?
Well, I don't think the Americans have said anything specific about construction in existing settlements. They've made it very clear that this administration, unlike its predecessor, does not consider the project as a whole as legitimate, and is Trump also envisioned the two-state solution, but on the terms of his plan, which of course rejected by the Palestinians and have not been endorsed by the present administration. But basically what they're saying is, let's keep the options open, let's not close doors. And this doesn't directly contradict the position of the present government.
Any other question?
Well, the only other thing is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and praying there. And
Delicate, very delicate question, because the police, I've been involved in this in the past. The legal position is clear. Jews have a right to pray there as they have a right to pray in open spaces, not in the mosques as such, but in open spaces elsewhere. However, the policy of Israeli governments also in my years under Netanyahu was that for reasons having to do with the Israeli national interest, we need to be very careful. Now, it's not Palestinian rioting that worries me. The Palestinians can riot and we can react. This is within our means and we have the tools, we have the police force capacity, and we should, and we've shown the Hamas what we do if they fire rockets on the Jerusalem issue into Israel. We respond with overwhelming force. And by the way, Hamas has been very reluctant to act recently. Even the balloons have stopped. The Egyptians are sitting on them very hard. There may be a deal of some sort, maybe also over the bodies of the soldiers and the two civilians who are being held alive, I assume, still in Gaza. But at the end of the day, we taught them a lesson about interfering in Jerusalem. That's not the question. What worries me is Jordan. The stability and the working relationship with Jordan, including the water issue, are very important to the region, to the strategic balance, to the safety and security of our eastern border. We have an implicit interest in the Jordanians' approval of the existing status quo in Jerusalem. They will never, under torture, admit that this is the case, but they prefer Israeli rule, Israeli sovereignty, to a Palestinian sovereignty that would kick them out of the last vestige of presence, importance under Article 9 of the Israeli-Jordanian Peace Treaty on the Temple Mount. So they have a stake in what happens there. And there we should tread carefully. The Messiah has not yet come. We have not yet rebuilt the temple. Whether you argue for it or against is a different matter. For the time being, we are sovereign in Jerusalem with a sort of tacit Jordanian consent, and we have an interest in keeping it that way.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I'll ask one more question. The new Shin Bet head, you were involved in security, National Security Council. Are you able to say, and Mossad head and Shin Bet head, will there be a change or in policy, or are they just directed by the government? What is the internal situation in relation to those two positions?
First of all, I'm slightly amused by what's happening because between us in this closed room with nobody listening, I'm a Wexner. I was, that's to say, I went to Harvard for a mid-career. I was the year 7, and these young people have come years after me. And because of his troubles with the Prosecutor General's office, his father's trouble with the Prosecutor General's office, which is replete with Wexners, young Yair Netanyahu at one point pointed to Epstein's relationship with Wexner and then called all of us a cult of pedophiles. So we sued him and he apologized. But I'm making the point because by now, of the 5 key positions in leading national security in Israel under the Prime Minister, as I say, Minister of Defense, and the Chief of Staff of the IDF, the head of the Mossad, the head of the Shin Bet, and the National Security Advisor. This is essentially the quintet. if you don't count the police, which has its own problems. But nowadays, these five, three are now Wexners. Aviv Kochavi, Eyal Chulata, the national security advisor, the nuclear physicist whom I mentioned, and Ronen Bar, who just took over from Argaman. Now, these are professionals. They grew up within their professional organizations. They are non-political. Ronen is essentially a fighter. It's been in the field first was the elite unit of the IDF, and then in Shin Bet operations in the West Bank. It's not it didn't come from the analytical side. It comes from combat. Fauda stuff. if you watch that series, at the end of the day, they answer to the government. But I could say very carefully that the defense establishment in Israel is compliant to civilian leadership. But if they feel very strongly that the government is making a mistake on something, they can make their voice heard. Given the nature of Israeli society, let me go back to 1996 when the defense established, Shin Bet and the IDF High Command and the Directorate of Military Intelligence all felt that Shimon Peres was making a mistake in working with Arafat. They made it known, and that had an impact on the public domain. So the professionals will not rebel, but they can tell the Prime Minister that what he's ordering them to do is wrong. I think that on the Iranian question, there is today a greater degree of consensus than there was 11 years ago when Netanyahu and Barak, the highest authorities in the land, together considered the option of a military strike against Iran, and all three service heads, the head of the IDF commander-in-chief, chief of staff, the head of the Mossad, the head of the Shin Bet, basically ganged up on them and saying, no, bring it to a cabinet decision. We will not take such an instruction without a cabinet decision. Netanyahu did not have a majority in the cabinet in 2010 for a strike. This will not happen now. Kochavi is pretty explicit about the need to prepare the IDF for action. We now have a sort of Iran command. It's called a strategic command, but it is clearly an Iranian command under an Air Force general. We all understand what it is meant to prepare. So, I don't see a situation under which Barnea or Bar will take a different position. The difference is going to be for the Mossad. The Shin Bet has always been discreet. Argaman has been a very discreet individual, no public profile, and this will not change. With the Mossad, in my other life, in my other function, I'm also now the editor of a magazine, and we published an essay by a Serbic Israeli critic of Yossi Cohen, Amir Oren, who says basically he gave the Mossad too much of a public profile, and he took a lot of personal profile. His impressive presence, is a handsome man, he clearly has some political ambitions. He's been openly mentioned by Netanyahu as a potential successor down the road. But that took the Mossad too much out of the shadows, or let's say the Mossad as a submarine submerged to the surface. It should, I assume that Barnea will keep a much lower profile. That's the man, and that's his style. But it's very important, again, going back to the theme I started, the relationship between the Israeli intelligence services and the American intelligence services, the deep sharing of information, the invaluable achievements of Israel particularly in the technological field, in our indispensable 8200, which is the powerhouse of the Israeli intelligence community, and also of our entire high-tech revolution. I think these things make Israel a very, very important player, even for the Americans, and we should keep it that way.
Okay, thank you very much, Eran.
You're welcome.
Shalom from Jerusalem, and I hope we'll see you soon, either in Jerusalem, on Zoom, or maybe in Australia, if Australia opens up.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Shalom to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.